If you were to travel to Maryland, what would you do? Where would you go? Perhaps Fort McHenry, or maybe the Ocean City Boardwalk. All good places, yes, but you didn't bring your car with you. Well, that's fine, you could always just take the transit. And so you head down a flight of stairs, the sound of screeching wheels and the smell of Marlboro wafting through the air. Welcome to Glenmont Station, a forgotten outpost on the edge of Montgomery County, Maryland. Here, the red line reaches its eastern terminus, its steel vein stretching towards the heart of the city, a place where, located at Georgia Avenue and Lay Hill Road, a bit away from Aspen Hill, your ride to a wonderful visit of the state's landmarks are sure to come. Yet, as you ready yourself to sit down, you see, or perhaps you don't at first, a man sitting down, slumped against the back end of one of the benches, but a dozen feet from the train tracks, his body twitching far too fast for you to notice. Perhaps he's asleep, a nightmare, something along those lines, and so you ignore him, waiting for your car to arrive in the hour, like many others before you and those to come. It's 3:45 p.m. Little did you know the man was also waiting for a train car to come, but for him, it was a time exponentially longer than what one could imagine from just looking at him. You didn't know the man, he didn't know you, and that was all that was needed as you boarded your train once it had arrived, thinking of it as nothing more than an eccentric occurrence. And the doors closed, leaving only a slight instance where the man's eyes had finally opened, staring straight at yours as the train sped off. A 2019 story by Reddit user sarcasonomicon called "If You're Armed and at the Glenmont Metro, Please Shoot Me," which I will summarize as the Glenmont Metro story, is an r/no sleep description of a man given a certain nootropic to increase his cognitive functionality, only for it to rather quickly result in a purgatory-style hellscape in which he perceives the world astronomically slower than any other individual around him. The story ending with him waiting at a bench for someone to, as the title suggests, end his own life. The story actually has an entire universe and interconnected stories chained to it that sarcasonomicon had created as well. This Glenmont Metro shared universe of sorts, which I will leave in the description. Now, the story on its own is something that is more of a local creation of sorts, something that is short and sweet to the point, but as of this current video, comes with the underlying notion of why the story in its entirety enhances the sense of dread and anxiety within its readers. The protagonist's experience with an experimental drug accelerates brain function, distorting their perception of time. Seconds stretch into agonizing duration and every heartbeat becomes an eternity. This temporal distortion mirrors chronophobia, this irrational fear of time, but it's not just time that haunts them, it's the existential dread, the fear of existence itself. The gunshot ripping through his skull symbolizes release from this perpetual suffering, a desperate escape from that relentless ticking of the clock. This setting that the story takes place in, this Glenmont Metro, becomes a claustrophobic chamber. Imagine being trapped underground, the walls closing in and time elongating. The protagonist's desperation intensifies the fear. They yearn for the shortest path to oblivion, hoping that the bullet will erase their torment. Here, claustrophobia intersects with chronophobia, the fear of confinement, inexorable passage of time. And that in of itself is this connection and reaching towards the reader itself, exemplified even more so with the fact that the stories within the subreddit follow this unspoken process of having to believe that the events are actually taking place, as absurd as they may appear in the realm of fiction. Still, despite that, the very capability that the audience has to interact with the story is what builds upon this new sense of fear. The very fact that the individual themselves have full awareness of the situation that is incapable of being solved because of the fact that the screen and they are talking to an individual that has already gone through this large amount of pain, one that is astronomical to a certain degree because of the fact that we measure pains the same amount as we would in medical settings. But the hurt that the person is going through is much more than that. But even more in the lens of psychological awareness in this entire story comes with the fear that is brought on with the entirety of the medication itself. This very idea of pharmacophobia, fear of medicine itself. And it's entirely on par with everything that the subject / patient that the story is revolving around is entirely on par with. But we consider the unknown when it comes to medical settings unless we ourselves are within that career branch or are capable of being observed taking these medications by an outside observer. these remain the cornerstone of evidence-based medicine. Researchers conduct clinical trials to evaluate new treatments, medications, and interventions. In the US, approximately 19% of adults or their family members have participated in clinical trials alone. And in 2020, the FDA approved 53 novel drugs involving around 32,000 patients in clinical trials. The fact of the matter is the contextual case under which the story is involved with, creating a composition of 4 innate fears that make the situation, more so than the actual story proper, incredibly chilling to actually have to bear witness to. Mostly under the capability to understand the situation itself. The typical human nature involves the aspect of freedom, the capability to fully move around free and without restriction, whether it's in a physical, mental, or even emotional state, under which every single quality that we have for our lives is built around the awareness and the foresight that we have towards our days. And what we are going to be able to do in the situation itself does not occur in a proper justification for why fear itself has had its creation in the claustrophobic nature of human desire of freedom, under which the prison in which the man himself is stuck within is one that is laid within his own body, his own confinement of flesh and bone. He is incapable of escaping from it because of this induced effect that came from the clinical trials that he undergoes. And that's just it. The very fact that the story induces this sort of fear into the reader is what makes it a composition that is well received by the comment section itself. Individuals who are essentially building onto that narrative by interacting with it properly. The 4 qualities that are to be included in these kinds of stories, or at the very least this story, would be claustrophobia, pharmaphobia, and chronophobia, along with phasophobia, all of which are composed together to give this notion of being trapped in an inescapable still position while the social groups surrounding the situation proper are still aware of the moving world at large. And that in of itself is the root of this cause of fear. To be placed in a situation where one is aware of every single situation that is occurring, yet in this case, that's not the ideal position. Because the protagonist is placed in a circumstance where he is set at the mercy of the drug that is being provided to him. To be locked in a freezer or buried under the earth, or to be in a coma, or to be lost in the forest, under certain cases builds with the idea that there's at the very least some form of communication that can be made with external individuals that can come by and give some assistance to a person. But if that prison is your own body, and people around you aren't capable of perceiving the situation of anything else, then what actually capable of being done at that point? Then that gives with it the proper reason for that sort of fear. And that's what makes it such an interesting concept. I read once in an episode of a webtoon comic called Clinic of Horrors about a doctor and his assistant essentially helping deal with this supernatural and abnormal happenings in the city. But in episode 42, the assistant, Bianca, is waiting on a subway when an old man notices her and begins to ask her about what she studies and what she does. And when she answers, he asks if she has any solution for his own predicament, describing himself as a cage of flesh and bones that will wither away until he dies. She says that she doesn't, and the old man replies that perhaps someday that will be the case. And that reminded me of the man's current predicament, that to simply exist is to be damned to age and die. Only Glenmont Metro's situation is different, mirrored actually, where time around us is linear, but when the line is exponentially decreasing and within any physical sensations, then it gives with it the idea of some alternative way to cope with it. Even worse still, what happens when any coping mechanism and format of boredom disappear with it at the same time? Then the individual is placed in a situation where no outside interference and internal conflict can essentially be composed with one another, with passing moments, lack of control, and a persistent craving for entertainment, despite the fact that it cannot and will not occur, which leads to the realization of such a thing. Learned helplessness occurs when a person, after experiencing repeated challenges, comes to believe that they have no control over their situation. Consequently, they give up trying to make changes and accept their fate, such as the protagonist himself had done so towards the end of the narrative. To be fully remote in the state that he is within is a complete set of classic conditioning that leads to a LH in the long run. But of course, any trigger of movement that will reset this thinking into a moment of hope for outside assistance, though, as the man continues to explain certain situations and hypotheticals that can occur, it eventually leads to the understanding that they won't occur for a simple reason that it would be too much of a hassle to have to wait decades to centuries, may the plan go haywire. And when suicidal tendencies are improbable, that leaves a vegetative state. When individuals repeatedly encounter situations where they feel powerless or lack of control, they may eventually stop trying to take action. Instead of actively pursuing change, they passively wait for external events to unfold, and this waiting time is natural and understandable. But when it comes to decades and centuries, it leaves a select amount of time to think, and internal conflict, as said beforehand, it begins to brew inside the minds of the person themselves. This leads to an increase in anxiety, which leads to a want to avoid boredom, which leads to hypothetical situations and problems that once again continues the cycle. Glenmont Metro is, for all intents and purposes, a simple story. One that currently serves as the prelude to the greater universe that is being built around the narrative, especially with an explanation behind our unnamed protagonist and the medication provided to him as well. But between comment section interaction and the climax of the short story itself, it serves as this horrifying situation that is only capable due to this composition of already situational and hypothetical human irrational fears. And the fact that Sarcasonomicon used this to his advantage to formulate a story to build on human nature to be stuck in place long enough to question just how long it takes for a human to lose their sanity when their only prison is their own body. It's a far larger cry for help.